Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We're listening to An Unexpected Killer.
September 15th, 2009. Police are called to an incident at Coral Gables High School, south of Miami, Florida.
It's not every day that somebody's dying in high school, especially at Coral Gables Senior. This was something that resonated with the entire county that a homicide would take place on the grounds of the school in the middle of classes.
On arrival, police are presented with a vicious and bloody crime scene.
To actually stab somebody and get the feeling of that thing going through somebody as they're dying literally and bleeding out, it's a very violent attack. Well, he did that 5 times.
To stab somebody 5 times, you gotta be mad at him.
Investigators quickly identify a suspect, but were struggling to understand their motive.
Race, ethnicity, social, economic background had nothing to do with this. This was as simple as a young kid who didn't know how to act or how to deal with his feelings, who decided that the best way to go about it was to put a knife in his pocket that day and start a fight.
This is the story of Andy Rodriguez and how a simple friendship drove him to change from a student with his life ahead of him into a cold-blooded killer. It's the morning of September 15th, 2009. Police receive a 911 call from Coral Gables High School.
I had just left the office and I was en route to do something in one of my cases when I got a telephone call from Sergeant Brassy. He asked me to respond to Coral Gables Senior. I was driving south on Segovia Street when the call went out. I started going towards the call, which was a fight in progress. Later, they put it out that somebody had been stabbed. I arrived at the scene shortly after 10 in the morning at Coral Gables Senior.
When the police first arrive, they are confronted with a chaotic scene.
I remember just trying to navigate through all the cars that were there and the presence of media on the scene. I remember students on the outside of the school. I remember parents, what appeared to me, possibly trying to pick up their kids or trying to locate their kids. Parents had been called. We know that parents had responded to the school in an attempt to contact their children.
This is very much out of keeping for the quiet, well-to-do part of town.
Coral Gables is very nice, very diverse with people. It's kind of more of a middle to higher income families.
It's sort of like the Beverly Hills of Miami-Dade County. So when you say, oh, I live in Coral Gables, it's like, you're very fancy. You're like, whoa. But, there are areas that are, a little more humble. There's a lot of apartment buildings and sort of young families. Like Miami, the movers and shakers in Coral Gables are generally Cuban Americans, people whose families have been here now for 2 generations and have really made their money and their wealth as doctors, lawyers, developers, people who are ingrained in the power structure of the county.
Crime is, you get your typical kind of car burglaries, kind of thefts, but nothing really, major happens there.
And in the heart of this historic town is the equally historic high school.
Coral Gables Senior High School is one of a handful of very well-known, important legacy high schools in Dade County. A lot of famous people have gone to school there. A lot of, just a lot of the community. It's an old school, so there's a lot of people who have gone through there. Members of Congress went there. Janet Reno went there, former Attorney General of the United States of America. This is a place that, people know locally.
Having made their way through the gathering crowds, detectives head for the crime scene to begin a full investigation into what has happened at Coral Gables High School.
I walked into the school. I remember it was a courtyard area inside the school. The positioning of the body that I recall was that the victim was found face down on the concrete floor. And by this point, I had learned that it was a stabbing and that we did know that the victim had been stabbed multiple times. At the time, it was early in the morning, so the student activity was cordoned off from that location with the exception of people who may have witnessed the incident, and of course they were removed from the scene and isolated or relocated to an area where detectives could speak with them. There was a number of students that needed to be interviewed. They had all been separated and they were in different parts of the school, mostly in the office area, but they were all separated in different rooms so they can't tarnish each other's perspectives or what they witnessed on the case. They don't speak to each other. So I methodically just started going one by one. I talked to each student, I did interviews, and ultimately I took formal statements on them, each one.
As detectives are interviewing the witnesses, a clearer picture of what happened begins to emerge.
They all had their different twists, but they were all consistent in that these were all students that are walking through the hallways between classes. And, you know, you can go back to the days when you were in school, how chaotic the hallways were sometimes. Not in a bad way, you know, just people screaming, people meeting, people socializing. So people's perspectives are going to be very different, and what they witnessed was going to be very different. So I got a lot of different versions of, I was walking through the hallway, I was going to my next class, I heard a commotion, I turned, I see two students fighting, and I see one of them collapse to the floor. I saw blood coming from his chest, or I saw blood coming from his back. So it was a variation of that story from different perspectives of the students who were walking through it. Some of the kids, I remember one in particular that requested to have one of his parents present during the interview, which of course we agreed to. The other ones were some were shaken up. You can see visibly they were very shaken up. The students were really, really affected by it. I remember the testimony of several of the witness students afterwards, how they still carried this very traumatic incident that they saw unfold in front of them in the hallway of school, how it traumatized their life. And a couple of them were, you know, pretty matter of fact. You know, some of these kids they'll surprise you sometimes with the way they react to things. While the crime scene investigators are conducting their portion of the investigation, I'm looking at the crime scene, I'm looking at the victim just to document what he or she might be wearing. I will go discuss investigations with the crime scene investigators on the scene. Did you see anything unusual? Did you notice any type of defense wounds on the victim, something that I may have missed? I recall seeing that the victim did have some defense cuts on his hands, and I do remember seeing stab wounds to the victim's chest. In addition to the stab wounds, I saw trauma to the face, and just at that particular time attributed it to the victim falling face first on the ground.
Investigators are gathering a lot of evidence, but are still missing some crucial information.
Most unfortunately, what caught everybody's attention to the fight in the first place was the noise and the commotion. By that time, the fight's already started, so nobody was really able to tell us at what point it started or who started it, only that a fight had started and that it ended the way it did. That was what was consistent. What we couldn't get at that point was the motive for the fight, because everybody's attention was called because of the commotion or the noise once the fight had already started. Another thing that was consistent was that no words were exchanged during the fight. Nobody reported that the victim said anything. Nobody reported that the subject said anything. It was just, by the time their attention was drawn to the fight, it was already the fight was already ongoing and no words were exchanged.
Another breakthrough comes when they scan through the school's security tapes.
At some point, it becomes known to us that there's cameras at the school. Now it's actually normal for all schools to have cameras. Back then it wasn't so routine, but this school had cameras. So one of the things I was asked to do at the school was to review the footage and to get a copy of that tape. And we did. And from the tape, you don't see the whole fight, but you see part of the fight.
The security cameras were in the courtyard, and what they showed was a fight broke out in the hallway, and the fight then spilled out into the courtyard. And you do see a fight. It's very quick. It lasts maybe a minute. And you can then see him. There's cameras throughout the school, so you can then see him running through the hallways and he's covering his head with his shirt. So clearly fleeing from the scene. You can see a girl who must be, 5 feet away from what's happening. And I think you can look at the facial features. I'm not sure she really registered what was happening right away.
With witnesses' statements and the security cameras footage, police quickly identify a suspect.
It appeared that the aggressor was going to be the subject. He ends up on top of the victim at one point. He ends up with an object in his hand. People report that the victim was bleeding profusely, that the victim at one point lost consciousness. And a couple of the students mentioned by first name. They mentioned the name Andy. They don't know his last name. They've seen him around school. And that's when I made the decision, as I'm talking to these people, that let's get this guy's photograph real quick. So while I'm in the office, I asked the administration, can I get a yearbook from the year before? And I research his name, and I see the page that has his photo on it. So I made several copies of that album, and as I began speaking to the students, I started presenting that page from the yearbook that has multiple students on it, and I said, look at this page, tell me if you see anybody on that page that you recognize, and each one by one said, this guy right here, he's the one that got identified, this is the guy that had the object in his hand, and one by one I began to identify Andy Rodriguez as the person who fought the victim.
September 15th, 2009. Police are continuing at high speed in their investigation into the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
This is really a simple, straightforward case that doesn't reflect the nature of the crime that was committed.
This was the kind of case that is really a dumb high school fight that probably happens a gazillion times every single day across the country.
It's becoming clear that the prime suspect for the killing is student Andy Rodriguez.
A couple of the students I interviewed saw an object in Andy Rodriguez's hand, and that they saw severe injuries to the victim's chest or back area where he was bleeding profusely. Ultimately, he lost balance, and he fell face first on the ground.
A quiet teenager, investigators learn Rodriguez spent little of his social time outside of his girlfriend, Daimilce Salgado.
In that summer of 2009, Daimilce Salgado was going out with Andy Rodriguez. They were steady, so to speak. During that time, Andy had become very jealous of Daimilce's, not knowing whether or not she was speaking to other boys at the time.
Apparently, Andy and Daimilce had actually broken up, and the reason was that he had wanted her MySpace password, and she didn't want to give it to him, right? And so it was this, this friction point between them that sort of set the tone for this possessiveness that Andy had over her.
That breakup takes them into the new school year, but they get back together in the first 2 weeks of school.
Similarly quiet was the life of Juan Carlos Rivera, who had recently moved to Miami from Cuba.
Juan Carlos Rivera was a young man of a Cuban family. His parents were both doctors in Cuba. His parents were divorced. His father then moved to Spain, where he was practicing in Spain. When Juan Carlos came of age for Cuban military, his mother decided she wasn't interested in having him partake in that and was looking for a suitable alternative to that. That suitable alternative for them was for him to move to Spain with his father. He spent some time in Spain with his father and didn't really take kindly to the life in Spain. And at that point in time, a family decision was made that he would move to Miami and live with his uncle and with his grandmother.
Juan's experience was very typical of what a lot of people who are coming from another country to Miami experience, because there's a huge difference culturally between the Cuban Americans who have been born here and whose families have been here for generations, and they all speak English, and they sort of have that Miami American, Cuban American culture, and the people who came within the last few years. So there's this huge culture divide, and even within the high school students. You get a lot of Cuban American kids who kind of look down on the more recent arrivals, and they call them, and it's an offensive slang, but they call them refs, or they call them refy, right, which is just slang for a refugee, right? And it's a way, and every immigrant group historically has had sort of these culture clashes with the people who have been here for a while, and they're just fresh off the boat kind of thing. And Juan sort of fit that bill, right? He's someone who just came over, and he was someone that sort of was this sad kind of figure trying to make his way into this whole new society, and societies within societies, right? High school, it's just, you have your different cliques and your different power structures even within a school, let alone within a whole community.
and grandmother in the same apartment block as Danielsis Salgado.
So in this area of Coral Gables, he was living in a two-story apartment building, much like the very old style where the doors face out. And he would see Danielsis Salgado. They never really spoke to each other, but they saw each other and they knew of each other from seeing each other in the apartment complex. On the first day of school, Juan Carlos went to the bus stop where he was going to take the Metro bus, public transportation, to school, because he had no other way of getting to school because of the socioeconomic conditions that he was living in at that point in time.
It's not a comfortable experience to take public transportation in Miami, and it instantly marks you as someone that doesn't have the means. You know, we're in Miami, whether we actually have the means or not, a lot of it is about image, right? It's about, you know, I can have my nice car to get me from, you know, Kendall to, you know, South Beach. And so if you don't have a car and you're taking public transportation, especially in a place that can be as starkly divided and judgy as Coral Gables, you know, you're the kid taking the bus to school, you know, you're lower class in the eyes of many.
She saw him there wearing his red shirt, his Coral Gables High School shirt, and she pulled over. And she rolled down the window and asked him if he needed a ride to school, having seen him around the complex before. And he, of course, took that opportunity to go take a ride with Danielsis. One, she was an attractive young lady, and two, he needed a ride to school and he didn't want to ride the Metro bus.
The previously sweet relationship takes a nasty turn when the green-eyed monster is revealed within Rodriguez.
Andy has seen that Danielsis and Juan Carlos Rivera are riding at school together for those first 2 weeks. He's not appreciative of this, and now that they're back together, he has asked her to stop. And she does. She stops giving Juan Carlos a ride to school. But she doesn't stop speaking to Juan Carlos. So when she sees him inside the cafeteria, they're nice to each other, they speak to each other, they have conversation. And again, these are more issues of jealousy for Andy Rodriguez. There was never any conversation, and there was never a statement given by anybody that showed that Juan Carlos Rivera had any romantic intentions towards Danielsis Salgado.
Investigators are beginning to understand the motive behind the attack and start a manhunt for Andy Rodriguez, who is on the run.
Students initially say he ran across the street from the school, and then residents from that neighborhood called the police and reported seeing a young white male running through the front yards of the residences and gave a description of the clothing, which matched the description of the clothing of the student who fled the scene, and units responded to the area. I was training somebody, we were just driving, we heard the car go out, so we said, you know, we started heading toward that direction. As the information kept coming over the radio, we heard that he was running across to Riviera. As soon as we turned onto Riviera, we saw a young, male running through the front yards of that street. Officer Bueno then kind of approached him and kind of cut him off, and he ended up in somebody's yard. We exited the vehicle, and Officer Bueno gave him commands to get on the ground, put his hands behind his back. He then went up to him, handcuffed him, and searched him, at which time he did find the knife. He then gave it to me. I secured it into a container to preserve it, and then we put him in the back of my car at that time.
Investigators now start pulling background checks and information on Andy Rodriguez.
So when Andy Rodriguez was brought into the Dade County Jail, the public defender said that he had never been arrested, he had no prior record, which was true. He had no prior criminal record. But at his school, he did have a fairly lengthy disciplinary record. I think there were 7 instances of discipline having been levied against him. So he clearly had some issues at the school and definitely was someone who had been known to have issues there.
September 15th, 2009. Police investigating the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera quickly apprehend their number 1 suspect, Andy Rodriguez.
It's right before noon, so it's been almost 4 hours since the actual murder has taken place.
From beginning to end, it really is open and shut in a number of hours.
With Andy in custody, investigators have to start the delicate task of interviewing him with the hope of securing a confession.
My wheels are turning. I have to be on point. I want to make sure I do a good job translating. I could ruin the interview. I could ruin a case by not translating correctly, by handling something improperly. So I'm getting myself ready for the long haul. I know it's gonna be probably a long interview. I'm gonna be in there for a while, and I want to make sure my head's on straight. The subject's already in custody. He's in one of the interview rooms waiting to be interviewed. I remember walking in and I was struck by how young he looked. You know, you handle these cases, and over the years, you're used to dealing with certain segment of the population. You know, more rugged. A lot of times, you know, the drug dealers or the people that aren't the law-abiding citizens in our society. But you walk into this one, it's a kid, it's a student. You know, this kid should have been in class at that time. He should have been maybe at lunch, but he's sitting here in an interview room in the homicide bureau because we believe he killed somebody, so we need to find out what happened. We go in and he begins to tell us the story of what occurred. And he tells us that the day before, he was walking in the hallways of Coral Gables Senior when he accidentally bumped into the victim while walking to class.
Yo iba a la clase, a walk to my class, y él iba para mi pasillo del colegio. And I imagine he was going to his class. Cuando él se entró en el pasillo, ya saliendo. When I was entering the hallway, he was exiting. And we bumped into each other.
And then he told the victim something along the lines of, "Hey, watch out, be careful," and the victim kind of stared him down.
And he bumped into you yesterday, did you say it? Cuando él chocó con usted ayer, ¿usted le dijo algo a él? Yes. Yes. What did you say? ¿Qué le dijo? Ten cuidado. Be careful. Did you mean that in a threat in any way?
¿Usted lo dijo de una manera como amenazando?
No, what's up?
I said it's normal. Then the day of the murder, September 15th, he says, again, they're exchanging classes, and he was on his way to a weightlifting class, when he says that he's about to pass the victim in the hallway, and he observes the victim kind of stick his elbow out. It's to kind of bump him a little bit. So he, in return, also sticks his elbow out and bumps the victim. And at this time, he says the victim squared off to him, and the fight ensued. But at some point during the fight, the way he describes it is that he ends up in a disadvantage because the victim somehow ends up behind him, choking him out. And it's at this point that he feels the only way he's going to be able to save himself is to reach into his pocket and pull out a knife that he found a couple of days earlier when he got off the bus. And he takes that knife and somehow, in the frenzy, ends up stabbing the victim one time, is able to break free. And at this point, he runs from the area because he doesn't know the victim's going to continue hurting him. And he runs through the residential area where he's eventually located by police. And that's where he surrenders.
He gives a statement where he believes that this was self-defense, that he believed Juan Carlos Rivera was going to do something to him at some point. Honestly, I think it was just an explanation that Andy Rodriguez gave that really had no merit. But at that point in time, he really just needed to give himself an out for what he'd done.
The way he described it, it was literally just bumping into each other the day before, bumping into each other the day of, and escalating into a fight. And he says he never had problems with the victim before, never knew the victim.
Mr. Rodriguez is very clear. He says, I didn't even know the guy. Didn't even know his name.
The person you had the fight in school with today.
La persona con la que tuvo la pelea en colegio hoy.
You know his name.
¿Usted sabe su nombre? No.
While Andy Rodriguez is giving his version of events, other witnesses are telling investigators the whole story that unfolded over the previous few days.
There's multiple detectives that are doing multiple interviews while you're interviewing the subject. So you're constantly getting information. And every time you take a break, there's a detective or somebody updating you on something else that they learned. And now we're learning that people have already interviewed the subject's girlfriend and other students at the school who are now describing, hold on a second, this isn't a bumping kind of thing.
In the time before the homicide, Andy will see Juan Carlos in the hall on a number of occasions. And during those occasions, he will attempt to intimidate Juan Carlos. He'll bump him. He'll say things to him in the hallway. On September 14th of 2009, the day before the homicide, he'll actually tell him to be careful and to watch out for himself.
In fact, we're now learning from additional interviews as the day goes on that some of Andy Rodriguez's friends had already confronted Juan Rivera days and weeks prior and had words with him. Basically, they were almost like bullying him because they knew that Andy was jealous because his girlfriend was giving the victim rides to school, and that was creating problems between them. And that's the reason why Andy didn't like Juan Carlos Rivera.
In that intervening week prior to the murder, Juan Carlos Rivera sees Denis Salgado at school often, and they converse, and they're congenial with one another. But Andy Rodriguez becomes increasingly jealous. he purchases a knife. The knife is a stiletto type knife where the blade is in the handle and it ejects when a button is pressed.
There were a lot of questions as to where the knife came from. The girlfriend claimed that they had purchased it at a flea market, and the idea was that he worked at another flea market, so that he needed it for his job when he was breaking down boxes. Rodriguez claims the knife came from, he found it walking home from school one day and just saw a knife and just kept it.
He says that the morning of the murder, that he put it in his pocket in the event that he had any problems with the victim because they had bumped into each other in the hallway the day before. To me, it was very evident, whether he realized it or not, that the jealousy that he had was brewing to a point where he wanted something to happen. He was waiting for that confrontation to happen, and he was going to make it happen on September 15th.
What is clear, both from the visual evidence we have from the surveillance footage and then from the eyewitnesses who testified in open court, that Mr. Rivera was fighting for his life. And you can see this, and he was stabbed 5 times. And as a matter of fact, was fighting up till the point when the assailant ran away. And then he collapsed and passed away soon thereafter.
So now we get this information. We want to find out what Andy Rodriguez has to say about this now. So we go back in there now, and we confront him with these newfound facts. So there's the information we're getting, and we ask him about it. Andy Rodriguez says, you know what? Yeah, it's true. I didn't want to tell you anything because I didn't want to get my girlfriend involved in what happened. But let me explain to you what happened. And he begins to tell us basically the same story. And he tells us that he was dating his girlfriend, and that at some point on the first day of school, he saw his girlfriend driving the victim to school. Well, he ain't like that. Even though he reports he wasn't jealous,
the incident that happened yesterday and today with you and him did not have anything to do with your girlfriend. El incidente que pasó ayer y hoy tuvo nada que ver con tu novia. Any jealousy? ¿Estaba celoso? No. Are you crazy? I'm not gonna be jealous. No.
In a young 17-year-old's mind, he may not even realize he was jealous. He felt uncomfortable with it, or he didn't like the fact that she was driving another boy to school. And he kept bottling it up, and he kept dealing with it the way he did, and then ended up all, obviously, erupting the way he did.
Andy told a number of lies in that statement. He told so many that it was really easy for us as prosecutors to call him out on those, and to make a jury see that anything that he had said in that statement really was to just get himself out of trouble.
When the interview comes to an end, police are sure that they have the murderer and his motive for doing so.
At the end of the day, Andy Rodriguez killed Juan Carlos Rivera over a jealous rage that he had over a relationship that he believed Juan Carlos was having with his girlfriend at the time, Dalmacia Salgado, which never actually existed.
It was something that seemed so teenage, and yet it escalated into this, knife in someone's heart, and this lost life, and these lives that were shattered. And that was the really tragic thing.
The friends, they couldn't give a lot of detail, but they knew that the issue stemmed from Andy Rodriguez not liking the victim because of the rides to school and the relationship that he had, or Andy thought he had, with his girlfriend. So it was definitely over jealousy issues. They just didn't know how to put it into words sometimes, and they'll tell you a 1-hour story, and at the end of the day, when you look at the stories, he was jealous, and that's all it came down to.
This wasn't a whodunit. This wasn't a case where we had to figure out, did he really do it? Did he have an alibi? It wasn't like these traditional murder mysteries that we all see on TV and in the news. It really boiled down to that raw human emotion of jealousy, of insecurity, of disrespect, these sort of things that pop up when we're young that we often, that usually just get settled in, fights or arguments or a fist fight at worst, but very rarely escalate into this very public killing.
From this point on, later that afternoon, Andy Rodriguez was booked and charged with murder after conferring with the state attorney's office. And now the case continues as far as continuing to do interviews. More students come forward after the fact. We were able to watch the news that night like everybody else, and we see students being interviewed by the media. Those are students we have to track down now because we know of them initially, and we want to see what their story is or what they witnessed the day of. So now that's got to take days. Sometimes it takes weeks and months to track all these people down. You want to do interviews with them. Some people actually didn't see anything. You find out a lot of these people that come out on the news, they lie or they embellish or they exaggerate what they saw, or they just want to come out on the news. But some actually do have value to what they witnessed, and those people we want to bring in, and we're going to do the same thing we did with the other students the day of. We're going to take a formal statement from them, and they become witnesses in the case. And all that information, eventually, what it does is it creates a puzzle. Everybody has a different perspective of what they saw, and it fills in little gaps of the story that maybe somebody else didn't see. So that's why all these interviews are super important for us.
Detectives have one last big thing to do with the case.
The autopsy for us was very important because the autopsy tells you the story forensically and with the evidence what actually happened. People can describe a punch, people can describe what appears to be a stab wound or a plunge with a knife, but until you see the actual injuries on a human being, that doesn't lie. And that doesn't leave anything up for interpretation. It's clear. A stab wound's a stab wound, a bullet hole is a bullet hole, and in this case, we knew exactly where the stab wounds were located, which even supported even more the fact that Andy Rodriguez was the aggressor and that Andy Rodriguez 100% had the upper hand in this fight, ultimately killing Juan Rivera. There was a total of 5 stab wounds. 3 were to the chest, 2 to the back. The ones that the victim suffered to the back, the way that Andy Rodriguez described, it would have been impossible for him to have done those stab wounds unless the victim would have been choking him from behind. He would have reached behind the victim somehow and been able to inflict those stab wounds. It's physically impossible. And that was one of the first things that we noticed in the autopsy that refuted or was inconsistent with what he said to us during the interview, proving even more so how aggressive and how violent the attack was and what his mindset was when he confronted Juan Rivera at the school on September 15th. That basically ends there because there's really no follow-up anymore in this case. It's wrapped up in a couple days because we have the subject in custody, we have the murder weapon in our possession, we have sworn statements from everybody that account for the fighting and the background of what transpired and what led to the fight, and now we have the medical examiner's findings of exactly what the injuries are to the victim, which nobody can dispute anymore. You can't say I stabbed him one time when the victim has 5 stab wounds, or you can't argue about where he stabbed the victim. We have the evidence right there in front of us.
September 2009, Miami-Dade County Police are close to closing the investigation into the senseless murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
From the time that the homicide took place to the time that the interviews took place, it really wasn't a lot of time.
He was just a young kid who was trying to come up in the world and fit into this new, very, very have and have not society, and this is what happened.
Before investigators can go to trial, they have to gather all the evidence they have against the suspect, Andy Rodriguez.
So up to this point, we have student interviews that we did that witnessed the fight. We have students who saw Andy Rodriguez with an object in his hand, and they see the victim bleeding profusely and falling to the ground. We have people who see him fleeing the school in a residential area, later on apprehended by Coral Gables PD. We have the murder weapon found on the victim with the victim's blood. We also have the victim's blood on Andy Rodriguez's clothing when he's taken into custody. And now we have Andy Rodriguez's own admission that he was involved in the fight, that he indeed inflicted these fatal wounds to the victim. He minimizes and he says, oh, I only stabbed him one time. He tries to get around it. He tries to explain it in a way where he looks like the victim. But the evidence is overwhelming, especially once we go into the autopsy now. And now we see, well, it wasn't 1 stab wound. It was 5 stab wounds. And 3 were to the chest and 2 to the back that were impossible by the account that he gives us. That's more than enough evidence that we need. It's overwhelming evidence at this point for the prosecution to be able to go forth and try this case in a court of law.
The trial very quickly becomes a courtroom drama.
The defense attorney is a very animated, very aggressive. His name is Alex Michaels. Very good defense lawyer.
He's like this Romanian guy with this very thick accent, and he always likes to needle people and go over the top with his arguments. So it becomes like there's a lot of tension in there because he's sort of grading the judge and grading the prosecutors and attacking the witnesses on the stand and through cross-examination. So it kind of just there's like this tension that builds up throughout the whole thing.
The defense attorney, Alex Michaels, he began with the defense of self-defense, stating that Juan Carlos allegedly threatening Andy Rodriguez over this friendship and that he had with Diomedes Salgado. And then it progressed into Andy needing to defend himself because these elbowings in the hallway were really the product of Juan Carlos, as opposed to the truth, which was that they were actually because of Andy.
The defense didn't have a lot of cards to play in this case. I mean, when the murder happens on camera and there are eyewitnesses, there's not a whole lot of cards you can play. So you've got to probably come up with some unique legal arguments to try to work on.
Came after us, and I think part of it was the evidence was overwhelming. At this point, he's got to find some angle to try to explain why his client did what he did. A distraction, maybe, I don't know what you want to call it. They do that sometimes. They want to distract the jury, and obviously, the facts go for themselves.
The opening statement was one that's very factual. It takes you through the events that happened that day, but more importantly, lays out the foundation for why Andy would want to have this argument with Juan Carlos and ultimately murder him.
The crux of the case was not whether or not Mr. Rodriguez did this conduct. It was whether or not it was murder or whether or not it was in self-defense.
It wasn't self-defense because Andy had it in for Juan Carlos Rivera from the day that he met Juan Carlos Rivera. He knew that Juan Carlos Rivera was a possible interest for his girlfriend, and that set him off from the beginning. He didn't even want to see Juan Carlos Rivera anywhere near his girlfriend, and he would do anything to make sure that that never happened. When a defendant gives a lie like that it was self-defense to detectives, it kind of pigeonholes the defense into what they're going to tell the jury happened, because they can't really go with another defense. So in that way, Andy had already set up the defense or the failed defense for the trial way back when he was interviewed by detectives.
At the end of the day, when you have a case where the facts speak for themselves and it's so overwhelmingly against the defense has only a couple options left: to attack your integrity or attack your procedures. And that's what they do every single time.
The jury don't take long to convict Andy Rodriguez of the murder.
The trial was fairly cut and dry. The jury agreed. They took less than a day to convict him. They convicted him of second-degree murder.
So it was a fairly quick deliberation. It really only took a couple of hours. I think they strongly took to heart everything that we said. They did consider probably the self-defense for a moment, but really paid it no mind at the end of the day, where he was found guilty within a couple of hours.
It was one of those that I thought would get played out to some reasonable numbers, but the strategy for the defense was to go to trial. My opinion is that he thought maybe that you'll get sympathy from the jury because he was a young kid. You just got to find that one person on that jury who says, I can't put this kid away for a long time. He's a young kid. But it was a very vicious attack and unnecessary, and I think that's what doomed him.
When it was all said and done, there was some speculation initially that he might be charged with first-degree murder. That did not happen. He was charged with second-degree murder, and the prosecutors were pushing for a lifetime in prison.
November 2011, Andy Rodriguez is sentenced for the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
The judge then had discretion as to the sentencing. The prosecutors wanted life in prison. They did not get it. The judge handed down a sentence of 40 years in prison and then 10 years of probation after he's released. That means that Mr. Rodriguez won't come out of jail until he's at least 51 years old. In the state of Florida, there's a law that says you have to serve at least 85% of your sentence, which means he won't come out until he's at least 51. And then he'll be under probation until he's at least 61. And the judge said that, Mr. Rodriguez, because of your actions, you have forfeited your youth and most of your life. And that's what happened to him.
I think the jury got it right. Yeah, I think the jury got it right. And I think the judge got it right. Andy, if he serves 85% of his sentence and all that, he should get out in his early 50s.
Forfeit your youth and the rest of your life.
Bars, the world will be completely different than when he got in there. I think the jury got it right.
In this case, because of the evidence that was so obvious, it seems like justice was done. And the real tragedy here was the senseless loss of life
That's a
on both
young
sides.
kid.
And the prosecutor, Catherine Fernandez Rundle, said after the judgment, after the sentencing, she said that the real tragedy here is not just for the Rivera family, but also for the Rodriguez family, that 2 lives were lost here. Yes, he took a life. Yes, that's depending on your faith belief. It's a mortal sin. It's an irredeemable act. Whatever it is, sure, that's true. But he has to live with it in this life for the rest of his life.